Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Dartmouth Community Medical School. I am Bill Green, your host and MC once again. We're at the passing the halfway mark tonight in our series, and we're going to talk about melanoma and something close to my heart, the immune system, and how that sometimes causes something bad, autoimmunity, but in this case, it's not so bad. Maybe it's actually good. Who would have thought? So we're going to illustrate one of the many different kinds of team players in this kind of science that we do these days with Kate Byrne, a very recent past PhD graduate student coming back from Philadelphia to tell us about melanoma and her work. And prior to that, Brent Berwin, who I'll introduce in a minute, will introduce her. And we'll go back to kind of a more conventional presentation compared to last week. And by the way, how did you like last week with the iPads and the smartphones? And yeah? Well, guys. No, so, it was really interesting. Afterwards, I had a number of conversations with people individually, and we talked this through, and I thought it was fascinating, too. I'm not that able myself with all the technology, but I think you'll see that, at least I hope you'll think about my take on this, is that different subjects and different times and different settings require different approaches to learning. So we're going to go back to sort of a more conventional PowerPoint presentation, but I think you're going to find it very exciting and very informing. All right, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Brent Berwin, Dr. Brent Berwin. I can't help but call him Brent because he's in my department. And as a fairly new chair, I actually recruited this fellow from a postdoctoral experience at Duke to come here to the then Dartmouth Medical School and join our department as an assistant professor. So I can't help but call him Brent rather than Dr. Berwin. Brent grew up in Minnesota. He went to the University of Wisconsin for his PhD. And then he did move down to had a really productive postdoctoral fellowship at Duke. But I know, because we talk a little bit of sports in the hallways sometimes, that his allegiance didn't transfer to Duke or North Carolina. It stays with the Minnesota Twins and the Wisconsin Badgers and all of those teams up there. So Brent came about 2004 as an assistant professor. He immediately joined as a really important member of a large grant that I and others are involved with in the immunology community called a COBRE grant. That stands for Centers of Biomedical Research Excellence. And we're fortunate to have been awarded a very large multi-investigator grant, team science, some 12 years ago in immunology. And Brent was one of the original full project leaders and did a great job. Subsequently went on to get his own funding as a principal investigator, both from the National Institutes of Health, for the American Cancer Society, and from several other local and national funding sources. He's a highly collaborative investigator, great sense of humor. The rest I can't talk to you about, but he will try to tell some jokes, some of which will be intended to be at my personal expense. So I'm going to head him off on that. And the following story/joke that Brent will tell you is not true. He claims that when we were in the final stages of making an offer to him to come to Dartmouth, and I was the negotiator, he will claim there was no negotiation and he got this really bad deal. And, that he was living in a tent. And just don't believe it. So Brent is a fine scientist, has done extremely well, promoted to associate professor 2 or 3 years ago. But his contributions to Geisel are much more than in the research area. He's a teacher of, appropriately for tonight, PhD graduate students in particular. And he's taken on many service duties in the academic setting, including one recently, which is to head the so-called graduate committee of the Molecular and Cell Biology graduate program. That's a lot of words. Translation We have about 150 PhD students in this umbrella program, and a small committee sort of runs it on a day-to-day basis, which really means that the chair does all the work, and that's been Brent for about the last year and a half. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Brent Berwin, and please join me in welcoming him.
So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. Everything Bill said was true. Although if you notice that there's a hat being passed, that may indicate what he did for my startup. I am the chair of the Molecular and Cellular Biology program, and that's one of the main programs here for how our students get their PhDs and how they conduct their thesis research. And so it's in that context, really, that it's a pleasure to introduce really our star speaker tonight, Kate Byrne. Molecular and Cellular Biology program, and really if you guys get interested in this program and want to see more about it, we have an entire website dedicated to this, and it'll probably provide more information than you ever wanted to know. If you simply Google Dartmouth and MCB, this will immediately pop up, and we actually have our address on the slide here, so that's probably printed out for you. But really, it's a joy to talk about who we are. And as Bill alluded to, our program has about 170 students in it, and they are in upwards of 60 labs doing their thesis research. So that's really a good chunk of Dartmouth and a lot of the labs at Dartmouth. And these labs include labs in the Cancer Center, they include labs on this campus, and they're spread across really both campuses. So if you guys are familiar with either the hospital over in Lebanon and or the labs over here, chances are you've seen some of the labs that our students work in. We have 4 component compartments, biology, biochemistry, genetics, and microbiology and immunology, but in the interest of really the spread of science these days into further areas, we have researchers, both students and faculty now, in a variety of different departments, including computer science, chemistry, and a lot of other departments that now we can interact with and get our science to go further. That's really how science is working these days. In short, we're the largest research program, graduate research program at Dartmouth. So we are the flagship program as far as student research, and it's something we're quite proud of. Just to brag on a little bit, there's been a few analyses of really the program. So a few years ago, there was a national survey on graduate programs, and one of their categories was molecular and cellular biology. And really what I'm showing you here, in the molecular and cellular biology category, there's somewhere on order of 130 programs nationally. Farther, we're the green slot here, and farther left is better. So by basically a power ranking, by their own bizarro criteria, we're a top 20 program as far as molecular and cellular biology programs are nationally, something we're quite proud of. It is a student program. This is for the students to get their PhDs. And once again, we rank very, very well. And it's worth noting that actually a bunch of the other Dartmouth programs do too, although I can brag on the MCB program for a while. We have a bunch of other very strong programs here at Dartmouth. Once again, a bunch of these green squares are farther left, indicating a bunch of top 20 programs in their own categories. We're doing quite well. Now, really to intertwine a little bit about our program and to talk about Kate, who is an exemplary example of a student in our program, but is also somewhat representative in a sense of what our students go through as graduate students. So just a few minutes on sort of how our program works. And it all starts with admissions, right? So we are recruiting students here every year. We have a class size typically of 25 to 30 students per year coming in, about 1/3 of them international and 2/3 of them domestic. And a few years back, we recruited Kate Byrne. She was a young, goofy young lady at that point, but showed a lot of promise, I might add, and came to us in about 2007 from BU. So just down the road, and it was a pleasure to recruit her. First year, after the students get here, it's largely courses and lab rotation, so every student here gets to sample a handful of labs and decide which lab is appropriate for them and most interesting to them for their thesis research. And so at the end of that first year, Kate joined Dr. Mary Jo Turk's lab. Mary Jo, there's Kate over here in the middle. Mary Jo is over here on the right. and members of the Turk lab, now both past and present. So they're over in the Cancer Center, and Mary Jo's lab works on melanoma. And that's really the crux of what Kate's going to talk about tonight. And she's going to relate a bunch of work that she did in Mary Jo's lab. Second year of graduate student, they've joined their lab. They now have a qualifier exam. This is basically a 10-page written grant proposal that then they have to defend orally. It's usually a good solid speed bump during their graduate career. They don't always regard it as fun, and Kate's going to acknowledge that. But at the end, they're quite proud of having gotten through it, and it's a good token of some work that they've put in. And now they're really starting up their thesis research. But you can understand that these aren't always the fun times. This is a bunch of hard work, and sometimes they have to consult with higher powers on trying to understand where their knowledge is coming from. I'm told that Kate referenced several higher powers in trying to get this higher knowledge. Years 3 to 5 you've gotten past the tests, you've pretty much gotten past the coursework. It's really about the research, and this is really a lot of where Kate shined. Now you got to understand that things sometimes work out, and sometimes they don't. And as you develop through, you tend to develop a little bit of a thick skin about this. And Kate took that sort of to another level. In fact, an entire turtle shell, as it turns out. That's her, I think, second from the left with a couple of friends. If I had to guess, this was probably the superhero race. Kate's a pretty good runner as well. But nonetheless, thick skin, a lot of work, and really you get a product out of this. And Kate had a terrific graduate career in Mary Jo Turk's lab. I'm showing you probably the seminal paper that Kate published. You see her here, first author on this. And really, this is the basis for what she's going to tell you about tonight. This work was published in a very highly ranked journal. And it's one of those papers that really changes the way people think about melanoma and treatments of melanoma and the progression of melanoma. So a very important paper. And this plays out in a couple of ways. One is this paper, although not unilaterally, but probably very importantly, got the lab a subsequent grant of upwards of $1 million from the NIH to continue funding this research. That's the kind of importance of this sort of work. Kate will also she did receive a award from this. I believe this is Melanoma Research Foundation. And her work was noted in several aspects. And so this is good evidence that what she was doing was quite important, and it was viewed quite widely. There's always a little bit of sort of the bittersweet part of this, and as the students start progressing along, they've now learned a lot, they're now quite productive, and now they're also headed for graduation, for getting their PhD. And this is where the other students are now clinging to them, hoping to gain this sort of knowledge. And that's the good part, is that Kate was able to mentor some of the students that then subsequently followed her in the lab. The bittersweet part is then watching an experienced and good student like Kate walk out of the lab. Kate is now a postdoc at Penn, a quite enviable postdoc that she got in Dr. von der Heid's lab, continuing to study cancer research. So that was a very good accomplishment for Kate, and I think it also speaks well for our program. In a quick summary, and as I introduce Kate, it's a pleasure to have seen her grow as a person and a student, and it's a privilege to introduce her tonight. I'll also say it's a privilege to introduce the MCB program to you, and please feel free to ask any questions. I'll also say I've got a personal investment in this, and this goes back to Kate's work. And so my quick word on this is I've got a buddy named Ted Murphy. We were at Duke together, and he was a postdoc with me. He got melanoma while we were at Duke. But one of the things I want you to see here, he went through some very intensive therapy, and it's going to be just exactly the thing Kate talked about. This is him 18 months after this picture. Now you see that white hair? You see how he looks there? Kate's work is going to describe to you why he looks like that. These pictures were not taken 40 years apart. These were about 18 months apart. Actually, it turns out that white hair and that kind of aged look, for what it is, bodes really well. That is what Kate's work is showing. So I thank Kate for being able to explain this sort of transition for one of my friends. And with that, I give you Kate Byrne.